You are listening to the I Choose My Best Life podcast with Dr. Saundra Dalton-Smith, a show that is dedicated to helping you live fully, love boldly, and rest intentionally. For additional resources, visit ichoosemybestlife.com.
Has pain, doubt, fear, or disappointment been a part of your journey? If so, I invite you to join me for 50 days of hope and healing within my devotional, Come Empty. Pour out life's hurt and receive God's healing love. You can learn more at comeempty.com. Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Saundra, and you're listening to I Choose My Best Life. Today, we are chatting with Sarah Frazer, and she is going to help us walk through those moments in life when we look at everything that's going on and say to ourselves, I didn't sign up for this. Sarah is the mom of 5 and a Bible teacher who is going to help us unpack how can we stay in a place of hope and faith and in a place of moving forward, even when what we're looking at may not look how we have expected. So, Sarah, welcome to the show. And I want to take a moment to let you share a little bit about yourself and about the work that you do in your ministry.
Thank you so much, Saundra, for having me. This is such an honor to be on your podcast. It's been an encouragement to me, and so I just thank you for having me here today to share. So, as you said, I am a wife and a mother of 5. We have 3 biological children and 2 adopted, both from China. Our house is really pretty busy. And in the meantime, I do like to share online. I love to write, but my passion is really Bible study and helping women start and continue with a Bible study, Bible reading habit, prayer life. I love to speak, especially to those moms who are either just beginning or just feel really overwhelmed with life and it just feels really chaotic, but having that regular time with God and His Word is so vital. And I really want to encourage women not to wait until your house becomes less crazy. This is when you need the Bible the most. And so when you feel like you don't have time for it, this is when you need it. And so I like to just encourage women in that way.
I love that. I found that for myself to be consistent in my Bible reading, I have to do it first thing in the morning. If I do anything before it, it's like all of the day just tries to zap all of my time. So I found that for myself, that's one way to be more consistent. I want to jump into this topic. You've written a book titled, I Didn't Sign Up for This: How to Rest in God's Goodness When Your Story Shifts. And I think for a lot of us, we have felt the shift in many different ways in our lives over the past few years. I'm curious, whenever someone writes a book, I found that typically that they're writing a part of their story to help us better understand our stories. And so where in your own life have you seen a shift or an unexpected change that led you to searching out this part of Scripture?
Yes, so I think we've all looked around and we all have those kind of subtle shifts in our lives, right? Like before we have children, we envision how it's going to look, and then after we have children, it doesn't look anything like that. Or marriage can be the same way, or even just a job. You might have signed up for one job and you find yourself doing something different. Those kind of things I think we all have navigated, but it's those moments in life where all of a sudden something really big happens that you didn't see coming, you didn't have a chance to prepare for, you didn't choose, and it suddenly put you on a whole different path. And so for us and for our family, we adopted 2 children from China. And the very first adoption, our daughter, she came home to us at the age of 2, and her special needs were much more severe than what we were led to believe, or we just were naive and everything. And it was an international adoption, so I think a lot of things got lost in translation. And so we bring home this child, and suddenly I find myself a mom of a special needs child. And You have all these dreams and plans and goals for yourself and your children, and suddenly it's shifted. And there's different things that you're looking at now. And so being put on that path, and a lot of people say, well, you adopted, you knew there was some gonna be special needs. But I think in my mind, I just assumed that it wasn't going to be that bad, or we just give her a little love, right? Love fixes a lot of things, not everything. And so love definitely helps and is definitely something that she needed and that she's thriving in. But I think that initial time where I was suddenly like, oh, okay, this is part of my life, doctor's appointments, therapies. This wasn't going to be something that was going to be an easy fix either. There wasn't going to be a surgery and then everything would be better. There wasn't going to be a pill. This was something that was going to be a lifelong thing. And so getting in my mind that sort of the vision of even the future of when my children leave might look different now. And what that looks in my husband and I as empty nesters, what is that going to look like? And so, yeah, walking into that, I began to really have to search God and scripture and really struggled with a lot of why God would allow, and even in my own daughter's life, like why would he allow a child to have to suffer in this way? And so I know I'm not the only parent that has ever asked that question or had those thoughts, but I had to wrestle with it within myself. I had to wrestle with it was just me and God. We had to go through that together. And that kind of sparked this kind of thought process. And the Lord taught me a lot during that process, that wrestling. And so then fast forward to COVID and all of the things I realized there were lessons that God had taught me during that time that I could take into this season as well. There's so much value in wrestling with God during those times when life is unexpected.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can relate to that, whether it's was through the time of COVID, whether it's something that's occurred more recently when they have maybe had a change in their health or a change in a family member's health or a death or there's so many different ways that our lives can shift. And I think it was interesting to hear you describe that because sometimes when we think about shifts, we think about shifts can be seasonal. There can be some shifts that occur that can be seasonal. It may not be something that's lifelong or forever going to be present with you. And then there's other shifts where everything has changed. It has completely changed the complete landscape. And I know for you, one of the biblical references that has been a comfort to you and that has been something God has used in helping to prepare you for your own journey has been the life of Moses. How was his story and the different confusing and painful plot twists in his life? How were you able to use those to get deeper revelation about your own journey with God?
I have fallen in love with the character of Moses in all the good ways in the Bible. I've I always viewed him as this leader, this great leader that was forever in the minds of the Israelites as this great man of God who had no flaws and was just this amazing shepherd and gave the whole commandment of God, led the people out of Egypt, did all these wondrous signs. And I came to Psalm 90 is where I came to in my wrestling and questioning with God and talking with God. And Psalm 90 was actually written by Moses, which I didn't know, but he wrote one psalm in Psalm 90. The very first verse says, "O Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations." And I just parked there and thought, how could Moses write that? And many scholars believe he wrote that at the end of his life. So he's looking back on his life and he's saying, my true home, my true dwelling place is with God. And so I began to look at Moses's life. That was the springboard for me to go back and really dive into the account in Exodus of his early life. And he was adopted. And that spoke to my heart as an adoptive mom. And then he was raised in a place that was perfectly positioned to rescue God's people at the age of 40. And I turned 40 this year. And so I completely identified with that idea of feeling like you've come into yourself, right? You turn 40. I felt like I've come into who I am. I have a comfortableness about who God has called me to be and what he's doing in my life. And so I can just picture Moses, and then he makes a mistake, a big mistake. You can debate whether it's sin or not. I believe it was sin. He murdered someone and he flees. And in his mind, his life is over. And he enters this wilderness period. And he comes back from the wilderness. We all know the story of the burning bush and how God calls him out of that season. But for Moses, he was in that wilderness season for 40 years. And I think he had really had that opportunity for God to develop his character, to develop his ability to shepherd. He was a shepherd. And even though in our minds we think the age 40 of Moses was probably he was great position to have this rescue plan, and God said, actually, I'm more concerned with his character than I am with the circumstances around his life. And so it really gave me comfort to know that even though my life might feel like a wilderness, like you said, some unexpected things thrust us in that sort of season, but sometimes those seasons last for longer than we even realize. And so I think that Moses' story can bring us such great comfort because, as you mentioned at the beginning, hopefully this message is one of hope of that God hasn't given up on us. And God is still in control and he has a plan for our life. And even our own mistakes, our own sinful choices, even the mistakes of others, even though we might think that we're in no position to be used by God, He can use us and He will use us. And so I think that's where the hope comes in Moses' story.
I love watching the way God works within people's lives within scripture, because as you mentioned, Moses had tumultuous kind of life from the very beginning, a lot of things happening that were not typical for most of the people during those times, just his upbringing in
Yeah.
that and as a basically in the house of Pharaoh, in the house of kings, whereas he was not one of those initially. So he was one of the Hebrew people, and just the way that all of these different kind of unexpected twists that came up, some good, some that were looked like, oh, wouldn't that be great to have this shift happen, shift out of a lifestyle where you are a Hebrew over into a lifestyle where you're, and then you have these other shifts where he has got out to the wilderness and having this completely different experience, very different lifestyles for the same person. And one of the things that you focus the person who is going through this journey with you back to is that our ultimate focus can be that we can rest on God's promises. We can rest on who he is. We can rest in his goodness. Why did you feel like goodness and promises and knowing the character of God was such an important part of the experience needed to survive these types of shifts?
Yeah, so it came from Moses' story and it came from Exodus 33. And I think we can see a really powerful exchange between God and Moses. Moses is on the mountain, he's led the people out, he's on the mountain, he's getting the Ten Commandments. He got the first set, goes down, the people had built a golden calf and began worshiping it. He throws down the Ten Commandments and says, you people are rebellious, the Lord is angry with you, and there's punishment. And he goes back up to the mountain, Moses does, and he's speaking with God in Exodus 33. And God tells him, you guys are going to go to the promised land, but I'm not going to go with you. I promise this. Like the focus was on God's promises. I promised this to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so I'm keeping my promise, but I've decided I'm not going to go with you. And Moses' response was basically, we might as well not even go. Like, we need you and your presence to go with us. And Moses had gotten to the point where he knew, as a leader, I can't do this without God. And so he said, you are a God of promise in that exchange. And then Moses makes this amazing, bold request. And he says, show me your glory. He asks the Lord, show me your glory. Because God said, okay, I will go with you. I'll be, my presence will go with you. And then Moses, he says that. And basically, God tells Moses, I can't show you my full glory because you're going to die. So you need to hide yourself in this rock. I'm going to cover you, and you're going to see the backside of my glory. You can't see my full glory. And he said, and my glory will pass over you. And he describes God's glory. God describes his own glory. And he says, if I can quote this right, he says, I'm going to let my goodness pass over you. And his goodness was directly connected to both God's promises, God's presence, his plan, all of those things. God says, that's my goodness. And we today have this amazing passage in the New Testament in John when it says that the Word became flesh and we beheld the full glory of God. And us today as Christians, there's a connection there. God no longer is showing the backside of his glory. He is showing us the front side, and that is Jesus Christ on the cross. His life and his death and his resurrection is God's full glory and goodness in our life. So God, that promise and plan and presence that Moses experienced, yes, that was for him during that time of leading the people of Israel. But we have Jesus Christ today, which is God's full glory and the power of the Spirit. Jesus left the comforter for us when he went to heaven. And so that shows me that we also, Christians today, have that ability to stand firm on God's promises and that He has a plan and that His presence is with us. And so those two connections were just so evident there in Moses's life, and they just made that connection to Jesus, which is such a comfort to me.
That's so good, Sarah. I love that particular passage of scripture where hides Moses in the cleft of the rock. I always find myself oftentimes praying that prayer, Lord, show me your glory. Because, and so I love that, just the mindset shift that you have presented with the scripture from John regarding Jesus being the fullness of his glory. Such a beautiful picture. I want to go a little deeper as well into this these interruptions, these things like you mentioned that occurred in Moses's life, these different twists and turns that occurred, and the twists and turns that you have had in your own life. How do you begin to view these interruptions as an opportunity and not slip over into fear and doubt and all of those other negative emotions and stay in the positive emotions of growth and transformation?
I think for me, when we brought our daughter home, it was, like I said, it was a period of me wrestling with God. I think I didn't give myself permission at first to feel all of those things. I felt I believe that if I felt fear or if I questioned God or if I doubted, then that I was not having faith. But in reality, I was still having those feelings. And so I began to go to God with all of those feelings. And I pretended that they were like this platter before Him. And I would just lay these things before Him in prayer. And I would spend a lot of time in prayer and in journal. I would journal a lot, but I would read scripture, mostly the Psalms, but I would just journal. I'm feeling really angry today about this situation, or I'm feeling really fearful, or I'm feeling really ill-equipped, or whatever the feeling was. And I gave myself permission to first grieve and really speak to God in my grief. I think there's a lot that has been written and said, but also revealed in scripture about lament and how we come to God with our sorrows and we just lay them before Him. That is not a sinful thing at all. I think that it is being honest and open with God about how we feel. Yes, He already knows, but laying that before Him and then going to scripture and I would just read. I would read the stories of the Old Testament. I would read the Gospels. I spent a lot of time in the Psalms during that time. And as I began to read scripture, pray, talk with God, I began to see God's character. And He started to reveal in my life how He is going to show up. And during that time, He showed Himself to be very faithful and we would pray and answers to prayer would come about. I would see how he was faithful to provide in all of these different specific ways. So as my mind began to get off of the situation and as I began to look up to him in prayer and in Bible reading, I really was able to gain a deeper insight into God's character and who he was. And that's what I focused on. I think it was very tempting for me to focus on my situation, which I felt very out of control with. Like I didn't feel like I had any control over this situation, but I looked to the one who did have control. And I looked at and everything seemed to be changing, right? Like I just felt like my life was just changing and I looked to the one that never changed. And so looking to God, seeking out who he was became a really practical way for me to keep myself from slipping back into despair or anxiety or all of those feelings I think we can find ourselves feeling during those times.
That person who is right now in the midst of that, I want them to have just some really practical next steps after spending this time here with us. What are maybe one or two practices maybe that you found beneficial in your case, or some steps that you would recommend to, let's say, a friend who came to you and they told you, I'm struggling right now. I'm struggling to trust God's plan and to stay in that place of hope and faith in the middle of this shift. What are some guide steps you would give that person?
I think I would encourage them, if they aren't already, to just start praying out how they really feel to God. Either write it out or pray it out loud or pray in your mind. Really spend some time with God and say, this is what I'm feeling. This is where it's really hard. And leave the questions there. And don't feel like you have to have the answer or just hand those over to God. But one of the things that I really struggled with was going to sleep at night during that time. I just really struggled because I would lay there and think about all of the things. I could stay busy during the day, but after I tried to rest. So I kept a little Bible beside my bed and I would read one psalm or two every night. And I read through the book of Psalms probably 3 or 4 times. And that's all I could really handle. There wasn't a lot of deep study, but occasionally a verse would pop up. And if a verse popped up and thought, this is a verse that speaks to how I feel, and this is a truth that I need to hang on to, I'd write it on a little card and I would tape it to my mirror. And so in the morning, I had this little card, or I'd stick it in my purse, or I would stick it as a bookmark if I was reading a book or something. And I would have this verse there in front of me and I could just read it. I had someone tell me you need to read a verse 10 times every day and to meditate on it. And so I would try to say, okay, I'm going to read it 10 times during the day at least. And then eventually I would probably memorize some of these verses, but the Lord really used the book of Psalms to really help me give permission for my grief, give permission for all my feelings, but it always points us back to the character of God, always points at what he's doing. And if you're looking to study a little bit of the Psalms, a great way to do that is to just look at the Psalm and say, what is God doing in this passage and how is he described? What characteristics of God do you see and what is he doing in this passage? Because God's very active and he's doing things. That really helped me a lot during that time.
We've been chatting with Sarah Frazer. She is the author of I Didn't Sign Up for This: How to Rest in God's Goodness When Your Story Shifts. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me. I want to make sure people know how to get in touch with you and how to learn more about your book and the work that you do.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been such a joy. If you would like to learn how to study the Bible, I have a free resource, a guide for how to study the Bible. It's at saraefrazer.com/workbook, and you can get a free download of how to study the Bible workbook. It just gives you an overview of the Bible if you are curious about that. But also, I love to hang out on Instagram, so you can find me at Sarah E. Frazer on Instagram as well. Thank you so much, Saundra.
Thank you, Sarah. It's been a blessing. Until next time, everyone, live fully, love boldly, and rest intentionally.